I have watched this club for years now. I've seen the highs of the three-peat, the absolute domination of Europe, the late comebacks that defied all logic. But this whole situation right now, man, it has been eating at me. Think about what happened last Tuesday for a second, right? When Real Madrid conceded the sixth goal against Bayern Munich at the Allianz Arena, the television broadcast didn't pan to the interim manager Álvaro Arbeloa standing helplessly on the touchline. It didn't pan up to the VIP box to show Florentino Perez looking down in silent disgust. The broadcast instinctively cut to an empty space in the midfield. A very specific, very quiet patch of grass. The exact space Toni Kroos used to occupy. Now, to understand the sheer magnitude of what is happening at the Santiago Bernabéu, we have to look at the wreckage of the last 2 seasons. For the first time in the modern era, Real Madrid have been eliminated in the quarter-finals of the Champions League in back-to-back campaigns. Last year, they were dismantled by Arsenal with a humiliating 5-1 aggregate scoreline, a result that many wrote off as a painful but necessary transition. This year, the illusion of a transition was shattered completely. Bayern Munich ended their European hopes with a chaotic 6-4 aggregate victory. You watch them walk back to the center circle after that Bayern goal, and you don't see anger. You see something much worse. You see resignation. When Arsenal put 5 past them over 2 legs, there was a convenient excuse. The narrative was that English football had evolved physically, and Madrid were just caught in a generational shift. But the Bayern defeat? That was entirely different. Bayern didn't just beat them tactically, they bullied them mentally. The players in white looked at each other, not for solutions, but to assign blame. The body language was entirely fractured. But the humiliation does not stop at the borders of Europe. Domestically, the situation is arguably worse. They currently sit 11 points behind Barcelona in La Liga, effectively surrendering the title before the final sprint has even begun. And then, there was the Copa del Rey, a competition that often serves as a lifeline for struggling managers, but instead became a graveyard for this squad's dignity. Knocked out by Albacete, a lower division side tearing through a squad assembled for hundreds of millions of euros. A match that will be studied not for the football played, but for the sheer apathy displayed by the most expensive roster in the world. It is one thing to lose to Arsenal or Bayern. It is another entirely to step onto the pitch against a lower league side and refuse to fight for the badge. Xabi Alonso, a man handpicked to usher in the new era, lasted a mere 6 months before being brutally sacked in January. He was supposed to be the tactical savior, the visionary who would harmonize the Galacticos. Instead, he was chewed up and spat out by a machine that no longer recognized its own purpose. Arbeloa was brought in from Castilla to stop the bleeding, to act as a bridge over troubled waters. But the bridge has collapsed. Every channel, every pundit, every newspaper in Spain is currently talking about Arbeloa's tactical naivety. They are drawing heat maps and passing networks to explain why the midfield is being overrun. They are debating whether the defensive line is sitting too deep or if the pressing triggers are fundamentally broken. But they are looking in the wrong place. Nobody is talking about what happens when the cameras are turned off. Nobody is talking about the silence. That is not a tactical crisis. That is a political collapse. The generous reading of this current run of form is that young superstars are simply struggling to adapt to the pressure of the Bernabéu without their veteran safety nets. The less generous, and entirely more accurate reading, is that the structural integrity of the club has been compromised from the inside out. They are not playing poorly because they do not understand the tactics. They are playing poorly because they do not respect the authority delivering them. The media is talking about formations. But the real story is about mutiny. To understand the current mutiny, you have to look at the ghost this team is currently chasing. For years, the footballing world possessed a remarkably superficial understanding of Real Madrid's success during their most recent golden era. The popular narrative was simple, almost insulting. Pundits claimed Carlo Ancelotti was merely a vibes manager, a grandfather figure who raised an eyebrow, chewed his gum, and let the superstars figure it out on their own. And they categorized Toni Kroos as just a passing metronome, a brilliant but static luxury player who kept the possession ticking over. But that is a complete and utter misread of what was actually happening behind the closed doors of the Valdebebas training ground. When Toni Kroos pointed to where a teammate should move, or when he intentionally slowed down a counterattack, that was not just tactical execution. That was governance. Look closely at the profile of the players in this current Madrid squad. Kylian Mbappé, Jude Bellingham, Vinicius Jr., Fede Valverde, Aurelien Tchouameni. This is not a standard football team. It is an assembly of apex predators. Every single one of them is a generational talent, surrounded by an entourage constantly whispering that they are the main character, the inevitable Ballon d'Or winner. In any other sporting institution, a concentration of egos this dense would tear itself apart within 6 months. So, why did it work so flawlessly leading up to their 2024 Champions League triumph? Because they operated under an invisible, unbreakable hierarchy. Ancelotti acted as the ultimate diplomatic shield, absorbing the immense political pressure from Florentino Perez and the relentless Spanish press. But out on the grass, the true authority belonged to Kroos. He was the silent ruler of the Bernabéu. Kroos did not just regulate the tempo of the football, he regulated the emotional temperature of the superstars around him. If Vinicius was getting dragged into a useless, emotionally charged feud with an opposition fullback, Kroos wouldn't yell. He would simply stop passing him the ball, slowing the game down to a crawl until the winger regained his composure and returned to the system. If Bellingham was pushing too high out of sheer adrenaline, leaving the midfield exposed, Kroos would hold possession for 2 extra seconds, forcing the young Englishman to drop back and reset the structure. Kroos was the fail-safe. He was the kill switch that kept the Galactico bomb from detonating. Now, take that safety net away. The moment Kroos retired and Ancelotti departed for the Brazilian national team, that delicate, carefully managed ecosystem evaporated overnight. This brings us to the tragic reality of Xabi Alonso's disastrous 6-month tenure. Alonso is undeniably one of the brightest tactical minds of his generation. But when he walked through the doors of the Bernabéu, he wasn't taking over a functional football club. He was stepping directly into a massive, suffocating power vacuum. Alonso tried to implement a highly systematized style of play, asking players accustomed to total freedom to suddenly conform to strict positional grids. But he was demanding this from a group of individuals who no longer had their father figure to respect, nor their silent ruler to fear. Xabi Alonso was not sacked in January because his pressing triggers were flawed. He was crushed by a dressing room that had suddenly realized they were now the most powerful people in the building. Without Kroos to keep them in check, the players stopped looking to the touchline for answers. They started looking at each other. And when apex predators start looking at each other in a confined space without a ruler, they don't collaborate. They compete. When an ecosystem like this shatters, it rarely happens quietly. The media will often portray a failing team as a group of players who have lost their confidence, sitting in a silent, depressed locker room. But the reality leaking out of the Valdebebas training complex paints a far more volatile picture. According to deeply sourced reports quietly circulating through the Spanish press with whispers confirmed by factions within Marca and heavily implied by tactical observers at the Athletic, the Real Madrid dressing room is not depressed. It is at war. The most alarming revelation concerns the interim manager, Álvaro Arbeloa. When he was promoted from Castilla, the internal messaging from the board was that his DNA as a former Madridista would command instant respect. But respect is not inherited. It is enforced. And right now, there is no enforcement mechanism. Reports indicate that at least 6 core players, undisputed starters, have entirely cut off meaningful communication with Arbeloa. They have reportedly formed isolated cliques, bypassing the manager's tactical briefings entirely. When Arbeloa stands on the touchline shouting instructions, the broadcast cameras routinely catch players deliberately turning their backs, looking toward the turf, or making eye contact with each other instead of the bench. This is a terrifying dynamic for any football club. Arbeloa isn't a manager right now, he is a hostage. He is trapped in a multi-million-euro holding cell with superstars who view him not as a leader, but as a temporary, irrelevant substitute teacher. But the insubordination against the manager is only the surface layer of the crisis. The true horror lies in how the players are turning on each other. When you remove the apex authority, the remaining predators do not form a democracy. They fight for dominance. This internal friction has spilled over into open hostility. We have seen reports of a severe physical and verbal altercation between Antonio Rudiger and the young prospect Carreras, a veteran center-back, frustrated by the collapsing defensive structure. Taking it out on a youth player is not a sign of demanding high standards. That is not standard training ground intensity. That is a fractured hierarchy, lashing out at its weakest links. However, the most critical fault line in this entire mutiny revolves around 2 specific men, Fede Valverde and Aurelien Tchouameni. For the last 3 years, The overarching narrative pushed by the club was that these two were the chosen heirs. They were handpicked to inherit the kingdom from Luka Modric and Toni Kroos. They were supposed to seamlessly transition from understudies to the new heartbeat of the Santiago Bernabéu. But without Kroos there to dictate the terms of their inheritance, they have succumbed to a violent identity clash. Valverde, bleeding Madridismo, feels entitled to the emotional and vocal leadership of the team. Tchouaméni, bought for an exorbitant fee to be the tactical anchor, feels entitled to dictate the rhythm and spatial control of the midfield. During the catastrophic defeat to Bayern Munich, tactical cameras isolated a chilling sequence, Tchouaméni screaming at Valverde to drop deeper into the pivot space. Valverde waving him off, demanding the ball be played into the channel, before both players essentially gave up on the play, leaving a gaping hole for the opposition to exploit. They are not fighting over a loose ball in training. They are not arguing over a missed pass. They are fighting over the empty throne. They are two princes tearing the kingdom apart because the king left without officially naming a successor. The generous reading of this situation is that they are deeply passionate professionals. You could argue that their frustration stems from a burning desire to win, and that these clashes are simply the growing pains of a young core desperately trying to find its footing during a dark, transitional period. The less generous, and entirely true reading, is that player power has swallowed this institution whole. The culture of the Galacticos, a culture that Florentino Perez has spent 2 decades meticulously trying to balance, has finally tipped over the edge. The players have realized that without a legendary figurehead like Carlo Ancelotti or a supreme on-pitch governor like Toni Kroos, there are no consequences. They know the board will sack an interim manager like Arbeloa 10 times before they bench a €100 million asset. They have weaponized their own transfer values against the club's authority. This is not a football team experiencing a bad run of form. This is a collection of isolated fiefdoms, operating under a complete breakdown of law and order. And when a dressing room reaches this specific level of toxicity, tactical tweaks become entirely meaningless. You cannot coach a player who refuses to look you in the eye. History is a terrifying mirror, especially at an institution like Real Madrid. There is a deeply ingrained arrogance at the Santiago Bernabéu, an institutional belief that because they wear the white shirt, European success is an inevitable right, rather than a fragile ecosystem that requires constant, meticulous maintenance. But history does not lie. And the historical data regarding Real Madrid's cycles of dominance should terrify every single fan currently watching this dressing room tear itself apart. Look back at the timeline of their 15 European Cups. The trophies are not evenly distributed. They arrive in explosive, era-defining clusters, which are almost always followed by devastatingly long, bitter winters. After the mythical golden era from 1956 to 1966, where Paco Gento and Alfredo Di Stefano helped secure 6 European Cups, how long did the Madridistas have to wait for the next one? 32 years. 3 decades of domestic squabbles, failed European campaigns, and broken promises before Jupp Heynckes finally brought home La Septima in 1998. Then came the first Galacticos era. Zinedine Zidane hits that impossible, physics-defying volley in Glasgow in 2002. The club thought they had cracked the code forever, assembling the most glamorous squad the sport had ever seen. What happened next? A 12-year drought, 12 agonizing years of the round of 16 curse, a relentless managerial merry-go-round, and billions spent with absolutely nothing to show for it in Europe, right up until the arrival of Gareth Bale and the fabled La Decima in 2014. The pattern is undeniable. When Real Madrid loses its structural identity and surrenders to player power, they do not just stumble for a season or two. They wander in the wilderness for a decade. If Florentino Perez thinks he can simply buy his way out of this current mutiny, he urgently needs to look at the shifting landscape of European football around him. The sport has evolved. It has become hyper-systematized, driven by data, pressing triggers, and absolute tactical cohesion. Look at Paris Saint-Germain. For years, PSG tried to replicate the Madrid Galactico model. They assembled Lionel Messi, Neymar, and Kylian Mbappé, creating a commercial juggernaut that functioned as a tactical disaster on the pitch. It was only when they finally abandoned the superstar policy, empowering Luis Enrique to build a collective, strictly disciplined system, that they broke through and secured the Champions League in 2025. They stopped buying names and started building an ecosystem. On the opposite end of the spectrum, look at Chelsea. The Todd Bailey administration has pumped an unprecedented €1.75 billion into the transfer market, hoarding almost every highly rated young talent on the continent. Yet, they are currently sitting in ninth place in the Premier League, trapped in a perpetual cycle of toxicity, bloated squads, and tactical confusion. Why? Because financial investment, without a consistent sporting vision and a respected hierarchy, is entirely meaningless. You can buy the best players in the world, but you cannot buy a dressing room culture. This brings us to the chilling reality of Madrid's current situation. The realization setting in right now, the cold, hard truth that nobody in the Spanish capital wants to say out loud is that the minimum 3-year gap between their last Champions League triumph in 2024 and their next realistic opportunity is not a temporary blip. That is not a transition period. That is the beginning of a generational drought. The current squad is entirely too talented to be relegated, but they are far too fractured to win. The board can keep firing interim managers, like Alvaro Arbeloa, and they can keep chasing new, shiny attacking toys in the transfer market to appease the fans. But until the toxic power dynamic in that dressing room is fundamentally destroyed and rebuilt, nothing will change. They are staring down the barrel of another 12-year winter, and the princes inside that dressing room are too busy fighting over an empty throne to even notice the storm rolling in. Florentino Perez is not a naive president. He has sat in that VIP box long enough to know exactly when a squad has slipped beyond his control. He knows that tactical tweaks are utterly useless when the culture itself is rotting, and when your dressing room essentially mutates into an unregulated cartel, you don't hire another progressive, data-driven tactician. You hire a destroyer. That is exactly why the whispers currently echoing through the Spanish press, the sudden, terrifying rumors about Jose Mourinho returning to the Bernabéu this summer, are not just lazy journalism. They are a deliberate threat leaked by the board. Perez has exhausted his diplomatic options. He needs the nuclear code. Mourinho might not be the manager to build a beautiful, fluid system to win the next Champions League, but he is perhaps the only manager ruthless enough to walk into that fractured dressing room, look those fractured apex predators in the eye, and burn the toxicity to the ground, even if he has to tear the squad apart to do it. But I want to hear from you guys. Tell me in the comments what you actually think about this unprecedented crisis. Is this current generation of Galacticos simply too toxic to be saved by anyone? Or is bringing back Jose Mourinho the final nail in the coffin for Real Madrid's footballing identity? Come back to this video when the summer transfer window officially opens, because I promise you, heads are going to roll. If this kind of deep dive, no-nonsense football analysis is exactly what you come here for, hit subscribe. We don't just read the scorelines here. We read the room. See you in the next one.